the Chevron Corporation for their generous support of our programming on Central Asia. And we are in for a treat today to hear about momentous events that are taking place in Central Asia. So I will give Professor Laruelle a brief introduction. If I talked about all her accomplishments, it would take up at least a quarter of the session time that we have for today. She, of course, is the director of the Institute for European, Russian, and Eurasian Studies and director of their Central Asian program and co-director of PONAR's Eurasia at the George Washington University. She is a prolific author. She has authored in 2018 alone 2 books, or co-authored: Russian Nationalism, Imaginaries, Doctrines, and Political Battlefields, and Understanding Russia, Challenges of Transformation. She has published books on the Arctic, on the Russian far right, on extreme nationalists in Russia and Eurasia. And so her research really covers all of the transformations of nationalist and conservative ideologies in Russia. She is currently in Krasnodar, Russia, and we're just hoping that the electricity doesn't go off. But if it does, there are other ways of dealing with this, where she is in fact doing some research on regional identities. So, you know, with the revolution going on in Kyrgyzstan, with protests that have been happening in Kazakhstan, and unrest and questioning in other parts of Central Asia, obviously the pandemic has hit Central Asia quite heavily, as it has in many parts of Eurasia. It's been a real challenge to deal with COVID-19 in Eurasia. And the title today, Professor Laruelle's talk, is Forces of Change and Their Limitation in Central Asia. So delighted to welcome you from Krasnodar, and we look forward to your remarks.
Well, thank you so much, Angela, for your kind invitation. I'm delighted to be here. I remember we discussed having that event in April, I think, and then everything got stopped. But at that time, we wanted to discuss the rise of civil society in Central Asia. And here we are now, 6 months after the beginning of the COVID crisis, having a lot of things happening in Central Asia, but globally in the region, right? What about what is happening in Belarus and the conflict in Nagorno-Karabakh? So the whole region seems to be suddenly very reactivated. So I was asked here to discuss the kind of forces of change in Central Asia, because we were planning originally to discuss about civil society, but also their limitation. And of course, what is happening currently in Kyrgyzstan is a good example of what is changing, what is not changing for the regions. So it will be a very broad overview. And of course, it's always a challenge to discuss the whole of Central Asia. I mean, as everybody among you knows, 5 countries, really 5 very different political, societal, cultural trajectories. So of course, there will be very much limitation in my own presentation, with almost nothing on Turkmenistan and very few things on Tajikistan, and mostly focusing on Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, and Kyrgyzstan. So let me begin first by sharing my screen so you can see the PowerPoint. Here it should arrive to you now. Do you see it?
Yes, we do.
Yes,
we see it.
Should be good. Perfect. So let me begin by the most obvious things, which are the forces of change that we can see at the political level. And I mentioned here the 3 main ones that many of us have been looking at. Of course, we had this unexpected perestroika happening in Uzbekistan after Karimov passed away, with Shavkat Mirziyoyev launching a lot of reform. That's why I like using the term of perestroika, because I think it's about a kind of opening and reforming of the system. Doesn't mean that it doesn't have its own limitation. I will be mentioning that later. What is interesting with the Uzbek cases of change is that usually the literature on authoritarian regimes in Eurasia doesn't forecast that reform could come from inside the regime itself, and from very high level inside the regime, because as you know, Mirzoyev was Karimov's prime minister for very long, and without any external pressure, right? So Uzbek elites decided by themselves, once Karimov died, that it was time for them to reform, with a lot of limitation, of course, but still a very interesting case on how an authoritarian regime can suddenly realize it has reached some of its own limitation and needs to move on to change the situation. Then we had the big street protest in Kazakhstan following Nazarbayev's resignation and Tokayev appointment or election. Here also a very interesting case, but a much more classic one for Eurasia. We are used to see young people among urban middle classes or upper classes going in the street to protest against election that they considered being fraudulent. This March 2019 or spring 2019 protests in Kazakhstan, they didn't really change the political system in Kazakhstan, and I will come back on that later, but they have changed the atmosphere. And for many young people, it has been, or at least for some of the urban middle classes young people, it has been really an important moment of change. At the same time, if we compare with the scale of street protests that we can see in Russia, we are still very far from the activation of the Russian society that we are noticing since several years in Kazakhstan. So Kazakhstan is still kind of far away from that Russian scale. And then we have what is happening in Kyrgyzstan, a kind of new revolution or a kind of coup, depending how you want to interpret it. So here also a force of change that is beginning following a very classic scheme, that of people going in the street to protest after discredited parliamentary election, where it was clear that there was a lot of vote buying and use of administrative resources to guarantee the victory of some of the party. Relatively violent riots in Bishkek, as we have been seeing them, in fact, since the early 2000s very regularly. And of course, we all make the comparison with 2005, the Tulip Revolution, and 2010, the overthrow of the Bakiyev regime. But then things got kind of unexpected for the people in the street themselves and for the observers, with this arrival of Sadir Japarov, suddenly freed from jail and pushed to power, declaring himself prime minister, acting president, calling for new election. Then today, I think, saying that maybe he will be changing the constitution to stay for a full term. So a lot of unexpected change in this kind of color revolution or street revolution, and a lot of resentment or disappointment, I think, by part of the protester that the revolution or the change has been kind of stolen by elite fights, and I will come back on that. So you see three different forces of change at the most political level, with three type of scenario, right? So for Uzbekistan, an elite-initiated and elite-controlled reform with its own limitation. Of course, the goal of the Uzbek regime is to stay in power through reforms and not to give the power to anyone else. So that is, of course, a limitation in itself. The Kazakh case is an interesting and more classical one of popular pressure by some active segment of the society. And then the Kyrgyz one, also classic for Kyrgyzstan, of both top-down and bottom-up activated movements. So people in the street, but also people being invited by their own network to go in the street in favor of some elite and vested interest groups of elites. So three kind of interesting forces of change. But then, of course, we have, I'm losing we have slower trend or less visible forces of change that I think are happening more at the societal or social level, that are very interesting to follow, and that in a sense are almost telling us more about what is happening in the Central Asian societies than the political level. First, you can have a look at this report published very recently by the Oxus Society, looking at the level of protest, trying to monitor all the form of protest in Central Asian society since the last 2.5 years. altogether looking at almost 1,000 incidents or group of people being in the street. Of course, it can be also street protests organized in favor of the government, but the majority of them are street protests against some of the governmental decisions, including almost 100 anti-Chinese demonstrations. So just to tell you that even if we have this kind of cliche with the Central Asian society being very passive actor, in fact they are quite active, but the protests are very often happening at the local level and are therefore not very visible for external observers. But globally, we can notice in the last 3, 4, 5 years a rise in activism and in very different type of activism. And we can see the issues that are becoming very, very sensitive. We have everything related to land and property of land that has always been a very sensitive topic in society that are still largely agricultural. Everybody remember the big protest against land reform in Kazakhstan that were really massive. We have a growing movement of protest around environmental issues. So it was very classic in Kyrgyzstan, but it's now taking a broader overview with a broader scale, with protests rising in different parts of Central Asia. What is, of course, maybe the form of activism that is the most followed is the rise of activism around urban issues. And here also it's Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, and Uzbekistan also leading, very similar to what we see in Russia about middle classes suddenly deciding to be very active in everything that is related to their everyday life environment in the cities and trying to challenge the way municipal authorities are taking decisions without having them participating in the decision. So all around these urban issues, you can see this kind of creation of a really kind of dense social fabric of different, I wouldn't say NGOs because it's really far away from the kind of Western definition of NGOs, but group of people working together, fighting for very specific issues like cleaning the street, controlling what is happening in their neighborhood, being sure that the local authorities will listen to their own vision on how the urban space should be developing, and then a kind of emerging, very low-level, local democracy level, forcing the municipal authorities to negotiate with the population. One of the famous cases has been, of course, the big project of Tashkent city, where the Mirziyoyev government had to, on one way or another, discuss with all the people that he was planning to expel from their house in downtown Tashkent, and being forced to kind of, on one way or another, discuss with the population. We also have an interesting phenomenon of memory activism. It's very visible in Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan, with groups also in provincial cities or in the capital cities, deciding that it's time for them, to be active on the memory field, especially in terms of the 20th century memory and all the kind of blank page of local Soviet history. And here also we see very interesting activation of social groups around memory issues of the 20th century. And then globally, social media have been exploding in Central Asia. A lot of things happening on Instagram, on Telegram, more than on Facebook or on Twitter. Very active Telegram channel for Central Asia. A lot of discussion happening even in Uzbekistan with different ideological groups fighting with over several hundred of thousands of followers. So we can see suddenly this kind of activation of local civil society, in a sense, or public opinion at least, especially in Uzbekistan, Kyrgyzstan, and Kazakhstan. It's, of course, less visible in Tajikistan and in Turkmenistan. Another trend that is showing that change is on its way, that we see younger generation entering state institutions. That's very, very visible in Kazakhstan, and it has been pushed, in fact, by the government, who realize that they need to kind of renew their civil servant pool. And you can follow what is happening now in Nur Otan, the presidential party, trying to activate young people and to present potential MPs that would be coming from this younger generation. And globally, the rise of what we have been calling the the Bolashak generation at a quite high level of the state administration in Kazakhstan. So here also change is on its way inside the state structure itself, and that's really specific to Kyrgyzstan. But we also have phenomena that we usually don't know about it. For example, you have a really vibrant startup community emerging in Dushanbe, something that would be difficult to imagine when you know the level of authoritarianism of the Tajik regime. But you can now download different apps in Tajik in Dushanbe that will allow you, to order food or order fresh groceries to be delivered to your house. So very interesting kind of micro phenomenon of young people getting suddenly active in trying to develop something at home to improve the situation. But force of changes doesn't necessarily mean a kind of obvious Western or liberal style of change, right? It can also, force of changes can also be more on the conservative or the illiberal sense. And I think we should be really realistic that many of these forces of change in Central Asia are not going in a liberal or Western type values direction, but on something that is much more complex. So we have a lot of surveys showing the rise of ethno-nationalistic feeling among youth, very clearly in Kyrgyzstan, Kazakhstan. It's probably the case in Uzbekistan, but we don't have the data showing that. We have a rise of conservative values, especially in gender relations. So with really young people becoming more and more conservative on many aspects of gender relation, on abortion, of course, on homosexuality, on what should be the role of a man and a woman in the family, and so on. And that is something that I think usually the Western policy community was not really aware of until very recently. And then it may seem obvious, but it's a key element, of course, the growth of Islamic identification and practice, not only in the private space, but in the public space. You now have, especially, of course, Kyrgyzstan is leading, but is becoming very visible also in Kazakhstan and in Uzbekistan, group of young people asking to have the right, of course, to wear a veil, but also to pray on their place of work, to have access to halal food, to follow the different Islamic ritual. And something that I already mentioned that I think is really important is that the private sector is leading. If you look at the way Islam can be negotiated in the private sector, it's much more visible than it is in public administration that still has this kind of old Soviet legacy of being very secular and very cautious toward Islam, while if you work in a big private firm in Kazakhstan or Kyrgyzstan, you can make your voices about your Islamic practice much more vocal. And so that's an interesting phenomenon, I think, growing on. Now, if we look more at the resistance to changes and the limitation of everything we are seeing, of course, there are, I think, many elements that show us that these changes will be met, of course, with a lot of resistance and a lot of limits. What is happening in Kyrgyzstan is an interesting element to make us discuss if we are looking at the kind of color revolution that we imagine is bringing a positive transformation, or if we are looking at a coup. And the element of information we have on the way the new prime minister has been pushed seems that is very much linked to the organized crime. And so it's really a kind of turn of the situation for the Kyrgyz society that is seems to be for the moment bringing more damage to any kind of democratization or pluralization of the political space than we would have imagined. And so I think we always have to remember that, yeah, this kind of street movement, especially when they seems to be clearly organized by vested interest groups, especially in Kyrgyzstan, where the organized crime is really kind of powerful in influencing the politicians, and the political life is showing us the limitation of what a new revolution may mean in Kyrgyzstan. And it seems that the political opposition has been disunited and didn't really was able to maintain the pluralism that they were hoping to get with that revolution, and now find themselves in a much darker situation. In Kazakhstan, also a lot of limitation. As I often say, it was the presidential transition not complete because Nazarbayev is still there on many aspects, but it's not a perestroika. The goal is not really to reform the state, but to keep things as they are under Tokayev. And it's clearly very difficult for the new president to kind of build its own autonomy from Nazarbayev. And so it's not that there is no reform going on, but let's say that the hope that many people had during the transition have not been realized so far, and the country is still struggling in moving toward reforms. And of course, COVID-19 has kind of slowed down any kind of reforms because the state administration is busy managing other things. The same with the Uzbek perestroika, a lot of internal limit. As I said, the goal of the Mirziyoyev government is to stay in power, not to share power, right? So reforms we are done in a lot of different aspects, and the latest law on kind of improving the place of Islam and giving a little bit more room to religious freedom is an interesting one, but it's also showing the limits of what the Uzbek government is really ready to change. And at any moment it would feel threatened, we could imagine that it would try to kind of close down all the freedom that have been given to the Uzbek society, even if I may say I have been impressed by how much Uzbek society has been changing since these last 4 years. And then we have the countries where we don't see changes coming on. We see more of the same, and of course Tajikistan and Rahman re-election at 91% last week was a good example on the kind of the old Central Asian authoritarian regime as we have known them for the last 30 years, with probably a dynastic system on its way to be built with his son. So here also kind of a much darker vision on how things can evolve in Central Asia. And then globally, if we try to identify the elements or the nodes of resistance, I think it's the legal system that, and especially, of course, the lack of any kind of free judicial system that is showing how much this regime institutionally can be still very immobile. And usually the only moment where you see the legal system being changed is when the government wants to improve its ranking in any kind of world index, just mostly targeting foreign investors. So in that case, you can see reforms are done to improve the country ranking. Otherwise, globally, the legal system remain quite immobile, and the institutionalization of any kind of pluralism that we see emerging in the society is not repercuted at the legal system. And then more on the kind of regional aspect, Russia and China have been reinforcing their presence in the region, and both countries have become more kind of hardliner, if I may say. China, after the COVID-19 crisis and the way it has been now openly fighting disinformation war with Western countries, and globally in Russia following the constitutional amendment of July 1st, you can see that Central Asia doesn't find itself in a neighboring that is, of course, conducive to any kind of transformation, especially because the US influence is quite very low. And here you can see very briefly the Gallup World Survey looking at the different Central Asian countries' approval of Chinese, Russian, and US leadership. And you can see that how much Russia is still very highly appreciated by all Central Asian societies. I can discuss the differences per country. China is somewhere in the middle, and the US is quite low. At the same time, as you can see, the lowest point for the US has been reached in 2014, of course, during the Ukrainian crisis. But it's now getting slowly back to where it was before, but still at kind of at a low 40% of approval. So let's say that the regional context is not helping Central Asia's forces of change. And so my last points on, so what next if we put all that together, right? So first we are entering into a post-pandemic or second wave pandemics, economic stagnation, and even recession, at least for 2021. The GDP of Central Asian countries will contract at least 5-6%, if not more, depending how you want to calculate for very informal economies. But we already know that there will be an increase of poverty. We already know that the level of malnutrition among young people and children in Tajikistan is about 20% of children with malnutrition issues. So that gives you an idea on the difficulties of the society. There will be less investment in education, and the debt to China, especially for Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan, will be very difficult to repay, and therefore will give China a new tool of leverage on these two countries. Globally, there is no solution for economic prosperity in Central Asia, and I don't think we should believe that the Belt and Road will bring economic prosperity to Central Asia. It can improve some of the situation in terms of infrastructure. It can also create a lot of different issues, and I'm happy to discuss that later. So we should be prepared to see immigration, mass immigration, not only of low-skilled people, but of the brain of Central Asia, of younger generation, living as much as they can toward Russia, South Korea, the Gulf countries, Europe, Turkey. So mass immigration will continue to be one of the key trends of Central Asia. Kazakhstan is still waiting for its economic transition. They have been mentioning it for a long time, and even if the world prices of oil and gas are low, we still don't really see how the transition will be happening for Kazakhstan. So economically, I would say that the COVID-19 crisis kind of continues or accentuated the trend that we were seeing already before for Central Asia. More at the political level, as I said, street revolution rarely bring democracy. At least in the Kyrgyz case, it seems very difficult to see. And so what we have been looking at now in Kyrgyzstan is, I think, more worrisome than bringing some kind of hope. We also, have to notice that as almost everywhere in the world, the COVID-19 crisis helps selling Chinese technologies to control societies in the name of sanitary situation. In democratic countries, it can be negotiating. In authoritarian countries, it's a trend that you can imagine will stay and help these countries and these regimes to keep their authoritarian practices by using more and more of these technologies. What I found really interesting is how much also globally, and that's also a long-term trend, I think the state administration in Central Asia have been beginning to accommodate Islam penetration and realizing that state secularism, as it was inherited from the Soviet regime, is on the decline, and then they will have more and more to give room to Islam to be visible in the public space and to be expressed. And you can follow all the discussion happening about, authorizing women to veil in administration, in higher education institution. That's really a very hot debate almost everywhere in Central Asia. And then globally, even if we talk a lot about the role of Russia and China and the fact that the US and the European Union are not very visible, I think that when we want to kind of think about the path of development for Central Asia, we have to look outside of this kind of great power competition. The Central Asian states themselves are looking at very different models. In the best case scenario, South Korea, Singapore, maybe Malaysia, if they want to take into consideration their Islamic identity, Dubai, Emirates, so we can go from more kind of secular to less secular model, but always this will to follow, to find model where you can have both technological progress, some form of economic prosperity, and keeping authoritarian regime and very often quite a conservative value system. And so that will be my last point. If we look at how the society themselves are evolving, we can see that they are becoming both more modern, technologically speaking, they are more and more globalized, but they are also more and more ideologically polarized. And I think a growing segment of the societies in Central Asia, and especially among the youth, is sharing very illiberal views. And so I think we have to take that into consideration. Illiberal or conservative values are forces of change in Central Asia, but not in the sense that Western policymakers could be hoping for. And so I think that gives us a quite contrasted vision where we see that Central Asian state, and I will stop there because I think I spoke enough, where we are moving away from the image we were used to have of Central Asia for 30 years of quite immobile societies and regimes to see that things are changing not only at the political level, but the societies are transforming themselves much faster than the political regimes. But these transformations are very contrasted. In terms of economic development, in terms of cultural and value transformation, it will be creating more polarized, younger Central Asian society, and this polarization can be both bringing pluralism and therefore potentially one day or another more kind of democratic model, but it can also create more tension. And I think we have to now accept this emergence of a very contrasted Central Asian society. And I will stop here and be happy to continue over the discussion.
Thank you. That was really an excellent and a very sobering tour d'horizon of these contradictory forces in Central Asia. I would ask our audience, if you do have questions, there's a Q&A function, and if you can pose your questions there. I'm going to ask the same question. I'm going to ask the first question. I would like you to go back to what you were saying about Russian and Chinese influence. And I wonder if you could be a little bit more specific about the nature of Russian and Chinese influence in the three countries, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, and Kyrgyzstan, and how you see that might develop in the future. I'm also particularly interested, for instance, in the Chinese reaction to what you say is the increasing influence of Islam in these societies.
Yeah, that's of course a very important point. I think the Russian influence is also getting more and more contrasted, right? First per country, but also by per sector, and it's getting both challenged. It's still there, but it's getting challenged. Maybe not where we would think it would get challenged originally. So if we go country by country, I think for Kazakhstan, the really big issues is not the Russian minority in the northern region. I already said that several times. I think the big challenge for Kazakhstan is that it's losing its strategic autonomy from Russia in terms of military strategic cooperation. Kazakhstan is almost no more independent from Russia and is losing this independence. And that is, of course, a long-term kind of worrisome trend for the country's sovereignty, even if I think Russia has no strategies of challenging that sovereignty so far. The support for the political elite is still there. At the same time, when you look at where Kazakh elites are liking, where do they like to go to travel, to put their money on, they try to be much more globalized than going to Russia, right? So the Kazakh elites are less more Russian-centric than the Uzbek elites, for example. The Uzbek elites are still very much connected to Moscow. The Kazakh elites are really globalized also because they have been enjoying more money and offshoring mechanisms. Kyrgyzstan is really in a situation, I would say, of still kind of being a client of Russian influence and investment. But what I think is really interesting in both societies is how much you can see that the narrative with the need to kind of to have a post-colonial vision of their relationship to Russia is rising, right? I think the moment where Russia was seen as still a good path of development for countries that cannot dream of being a kind of following a Western model, I think that time is over. In Kazakhstan, the level of criticism toward the Eurasian Economic Union is quite high. And everything I was saying about memory activism, so really now looking at the blank page of local Soviet history, denouncing the Soviet Union as a colonial power, criticizing Russia as keeping these countries in a colonial situation, it's really a rising trend among younger kind of urban elites. And I think that will be something that, and you can see the Russian reaction is usually very hot on this issue. So they know it's something sensitive that they will have to deal one day or another. So I think we are still in a situation where Russia is still number one in terms of strategic presence in the region. The Uzbek government has been working very closely with the Uzbek, with the Russians, and in a sense closer than during Karimov time. So the strategic domination is there, but the economic domination, of course, is not really there anymore. And the cultural domination is getting challenged. But here also you need to look at several different elements, right? Labor migration recreated a new level of Russian influence for a lot of the rural population in Central Asia for whom Russia is the best things you can hope for in your life. But for urban elites, I think the level of criticism toward Russia is really rising now. For China, the situation is much more complicated, and China doesn't have any of the soft power tool that Russia has in the region. No one in Central Asia is really admiring China. They may admire China for its economic development, but no one is really wanted to look at China as the model to follow. No one is admiring Chinese culture. And I think what is happening with the Uyghurs, even if we often hear here in the US criticism toward the Central Asian state not really kind of voicing their disagreement toward what is happening to the re-education camp for Uyghurs, I think globally, part of the societies in Central Asia that are aware of the situation see it as very critical, and it would be very difficult for China to be able to move on that and kind of erase this vision of China as being the enemy of Islam. And I think, as I was saying, that Islamic identification is growing in Central Asia. I think it will be more and more difficult for China to find a language with this kind of more Islamic-oriented younger generation, because everything China is doing in China itself is interpreted as being an anti-Islamic narrative. So yeah, I think on the long run, it's something that China will be challenged at, and that will be difficult for them to find a solution on that.
Thank you. Okay, now we'll start with the questions. First question, do you see tensions in Kazakhstan or other societies between better off Russian language speaking Kazakhs and Kazakh speaking Kazakhs outside the urban centers?
Yeah, that's a good point. I think it's a rising tension inside the Kazakh societies, and you can see, so you have several lines of divide, right, between the Russian speaker and the Kazakh speaker, ethnic Kazakhs, and between the urban one and the rural one. So the Kazakh society, not in the sense of Kazakhstani, but in the sense of ethnically Kazakh society, is really quite divided on its own identity, urban, rural, Russian speaking, Kazakh speaking. And you have more and more a trend to kind of exclude or criticize the Russian-speaking Kazakhs are being too much Sovietized, Russified, and not being representative of the real, what would be genuine Kazakhnesss. So that's a key element that I think every Kazakh who is a Russian speaker is feeling some kind of cultural pressure to shift to Kazakh language. And then you have the pressure of maybe not rural Kazakh, but I would say Kazakhs from small provincial cities who feel that their social promotion is being blocked compared to the social promotion and the kind of quality of life that urban Kazakhs from big cities could obtain these last decades. And so here I think there is also a lot of cultural pressure among this kind of provincial middle classes in trying to reach out the level of the urban Kazakhs living in Astana and Almaty, or sorry, Nur-Sultan and Almaty mostly. So yeah, I think the Kazakh society is extremely divided. It's also divided on the relationship between ethnic identity and religion. You have Kazakhs who can be very strong ethno-nationalists, but in a very secular way, and those who consider that if you are proud of your Kazakhnesss, it should go with an Islamic identity. So I think this division will be growing in the forthcoming years.
Thank you. Next question. Could you please talk more about memory activism?
Yeah, that's a really interesting phenomenon. It's also there in Uzbekistan, but I know less about it and it's less visible, but it's very much there in Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan, with a lot now of group at the local level, not only in the capital city, organizing themselves, for example, to rehabilitate the local figure that got repressed during the 30s. So you have really movement trying, to put pressure on the municipal authorities, asking them to recognize, to rename streets, to rename monuments, and to give memory back to the local figure who got repressed mostly during the 30s. So it's an interesting phenomenon because it's really bottom up, right? It's really coming from different levels of the society. It's not something that the municipal authority will do by themselves. when they decide to rename places or streets, they usually do it because they are pressured from some local groups who are trying to reactivate this memory of those who got repressed during Soviet time. It's usually Soviet time and Stalinist repression, but more globally also about the early 20th century big figure. So it's an interesting phenomenon of people suddenly kind of rediscovering their local, genealogy, their tradition, who were the important families in their village or in their cities who got repressed and who disappeared and who should be celebrated. And we have that both in Kyrgyzstan and in Kazakhstan in a quite active manner.
Great. Next question. What is Russia's take on the recent events in Kyrgyzstan? How do Russian mainstream media refer to the events? Revolution, coup, US-China-backed change of power, etc.
Well, the Russian media, from what I have seen here, mostly look at that like, the usual Russian media kind of narrative. It's a dangerous, street revolution are always dangerous. You don't want this instability coming from the street. It's mostly a coup. We don't really understand who is in the background. There is not a clear conspirationist narrative visible. Maybe in some of the Solovyov or Kistilyov show that would be visible, but on the classic news, I would say the conspiracy narrative is not very much there, but the narrative about instability is dangerous, don't do the same, otherwise you will find yourself in the similar situation, is very much there. But it's not covered so much by the Russian news. The Russian news are busy with Belarus and with Nagorno-Karabakh more than they are with what is happening in Kyrgyzstan.
Okay. Next question. What kind of strategies and tools available for Central Asian governments to negotiate with Chinese investment strategy, which is threatening their national integrity?
Well, it's difficult to identify what they would consider as threatening their national integrity, right? Because very often Central Asian governments would think about their own regime survival before thinking about the long-term sovereignty of the state itself. You can see in the way they are buying Chinese technology without any kind of public debates, as we have in the US or in Europe, about what that means to be so dependent technologically from China. These kind of debates don't really appear here in Central Asia. My impression is that when they try to negotiate with China, they try to play off the fact that they have that China may have competitors coming from other countries, and that the Central Asian government could potentially buy what they need from Western countries without the same kind of string attached, but another kind of political freedom string attached. But I think that's one of the problems, that the Central Asian government have very few tools to kind of argue and negotiate with their Chinese partner, because I mean everybody knows in Central Asia that Russian investment are in fact quite limited. When Russia say it will be giving a lot to the region, is often erasing debt, but not really giving kind of cash money or direct investment to the region. So the room of maneuver of the Central Asian governments towards China is quite limited, because China is more or less the only one able to give so much investment. Something also interesting, I think, to realize that China power inside some of institutions like the Asian development banks make that for Central Asian countries, sometimes it's also difficult to negotiate with multilateral institutions, because they know that the connection and the influence of China inside this multilateral institution are also very strong. So in a sense, they are kind of taken hostage by the Chinese power of money and investment.
Great. The next question, you talked about this a little bit, but I think maybe the questioner would like a little more detail. To what extent do you see the Chinese persecution of Uyghurs, Kazakh Kyrgyz influencing the Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan governments and broader populations' perceptions of China?
Yes, so at the government level, I think we should dissociate what the government can say publicly, and they cannot say a lot, of course, because they don't want to create too much disturbances in their relations to China. But at the elite level, I think the level of concern is quite high not so much toward the Uyghur than toward their own co-ethnics in the region, right? So the fact that some Kazakhs were sent in the re-education camp, creating much more effect on the elites of Kazakhstan than the fact that the Uyghurs were there, right? Because not everybody has a kind of pan-Turkic feeling of solidarity with the Uyghurs themselves, even if some has. But the narrative that you can hear in the regions among those who follow what is happening in China is that what China is doing to its own population, it will be able to do it to Central Asia in a few years or in a few decades when Chinese power will be stronger. So my impression is that people who are aware of the situation interpret that as the kind of long historical fight of Chinese culture against Islam. So China, the kind of historical enemy of Islam, and no one really buy the narrative about Uyghurs being terrorists. I mean, that's both at the official level, but people who follow the situation understood that it's really broader. It's a broader strategy of transforming from very deep inside the Uyghur society in being sure that it will not try to resist to the colonization happening. So if you follow on social media, for example, in Kazakhstan, especially in Kyrgyzstan, the anti-Chinese feeling have been rising, right? And so it's always connected. It's not so much about the repression of Uyghurs are Muslim, it's also about the colonization by Han Chinese of the Xinjiang region, because then people can parallel it with the fear of a so-called Chinese invasion of Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan. And you know that, especially among ethnic Kazakhs and ethnic Kyrgyz, but ethnic Kazakh is really strong, this impression that China is trying to buy agricultural land to send its own kind of Han Chinese colonizer is really something very spread. So it's very much linked to this kind of agricultural colonization aspect or demographic colonization aspect.
Thank you. Next question. To what extent have these three regimes become more authoritarian during the COVID pandemic? What practices and policies do they find their expression in them?
Yeah, that's also a good question. I mean, I think both the Kazakh and the Uzbek government managed the crisis pretty well. They got pretty knowing their level of non-transparency, historically speaking, they got pretty transparent in managing, at least in announcing the first cases, in explaining why lockdown was necessary, in trying to showcase how much they were trying to be active in developing regional cooperation, receiving international aid. So I think at that level, they show some level of transparency that could have been less. Where they have been more repressive and more authoritarian, it's in, of course, using that as a way to control the population, as I said, to buy new Chinese technologies for example, facial recognition, but also globally in trying to be repressive toward either bloggers or nurses and doctors who are trying to have their own narrative about what was happening in hospital. Right, so on that moment where it's the civil society that is becoming more active, where you have bloggers or nurses or doctors denouncing, the lack of medication, the fact that hospital cannot manage, that emergency services are overwhelmed, then the regimes got more repressive in trying to kind of have these voices shut down. So I think they show both a form of transparency and a form of more repressive strategies to where those who were describing things that were happening on the ground in each kind of local cities or in each hospital.
Thank you. Next question. Could you talk more about recent changes in Uzbekistan's business climate and the government's strategy of attracting foreign investment? Do you think that the changes in business climate will lead to the reduction of corruption?
Yeah, that's a good question. I'm not sure. I think there are ways, and many countries in the world are finding ways to improve their business climate for attracting foreign investor and still have a kind of high level of corruption. I think what may happen is that the corruption will become, in a sense, more controlled and kind of put more in the very well-oiled mechanism of having contract done. So I think, for example, that foreign investor will be able to complain for some form of corruption at the local level, but they will still have to deal with a very high level institutionalized form of corruption. So I think that's a strategy that can help foreign investors doing business in the region, but I don't think that the level of corruption will diminish. I think it will just be kind of more controlled or better negotiated in a more kind of constructive way with the foreign investor, but corruption will still be there. And I don't think any of the government are really ready to fight against corruption when corruption concerns the elites themselves. They just want foreign investors to be able to work in predictable framework, right? But you can have a predictable framework of doing business that includes corruption, right? So, and I think that's what they look at the Chinese model. That's what they are looking for, the kind of functional corruption that doesn't deter foreign investors.
Functional corruption, a great concept. The next question. It seems as if Mirziyoyev, in contrast to Karimov, is pursuing a position of greater cooperation and leadership among the other Central Asian states. Is this correct? And do you think it speaks to a new desire to become more of a regional power? If so, what would that look like for Uzbekistan?
Yeah, I think that's one of the first change that we noticed, right? Immediately as Mirziyoyev arrived in power, he began relaunching channel of discussion with both Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan. And I think thanks to these changes, the regional cooperation atmosphere really changed in the region. It's not never perfect. There are still tensions at the borders, of course, but you can see that the 5 Central Asian presidents are able to talk to each other. They are able to make some demonstration of regional cooperation, regional assistance during COVID-19. Clearly, the Tashkent authorities had a real communication strategies of showing how they are partnering with the other states in the region to help with the pandemic. So I think it's both a facade, a communication tool, but it's also really happening at the official level. The 5 states are ready to cooperate at a bigger level. Of course, potentially, when you follow what is happening in Uzbekistan, you can see that their dream is to become the regional power, and very often they are putting themselves in parallel with Kazakhstan. And of course, Uzbekistan is the kind of the historical regional power. It's the demographic regional power, but economically, it will still have a lot to do to be able to reach Kazakhstani level. At the same time, because the Kazakhstani economy is slowing down and the kind of golden age of easy oil and gas money is probably over for Kazakhstan, you could imagine that some of the Uzbek ambitions are potentially reachable because the Kazakh economy will be slowing down probably for long. At the same time, I don't think that Uzbekistan is on its way to become so powerful that it will be really leading the region. So I think what we will see is either a tandem or a competition between Uzbekistan and Kazakhstan, depending how the elites want to make it. So far, it's more about the cooperation and a regional framework of the 5 states trying to do more together. We are still very far on any kind of regional institutionalized cooperation, right? We are still far on any kind of, I don't know, custom union of the 5 Central Asian states, and Russia and China have no interest in having this kind of cooperation developing too fast, because that would give the region more autonomy. But you can see that the local governments are ready to cooperate on some bilateral and regional issues really at a higher level than ever before. So it's a positive trend for the region.
Thank you. Next question. What are your thoughts about Tokayev's attempts at reform, such as the promise to soften the law on protests? Is there a sense that Tokayev wants to differentiate himself from Nazarbayev, or does he still mostly reflect elite views and interests?
I think Tokayev is the product of the elites and is reflecting the Kazakhstani elite's view. At the same time, he doesn't have the same legitimacy as Nazarbayev. He's not the father of the nation. He's not the first president. So he knows, I think, very well, and around him, people that are in higher seats, they know very much that they have to negotiate some form of interaction with the societies. I think that was clearly understood. And so all the point for them is to find the right equilibrium where they feel that they are softening on some aspect and keeping power for themselves on the others. But I think there is a general perception among the Kazakhstani elites, also with this arrival of a new generation, of the Bolashak generation, and more globally of younger people, that you cannot just be an authoritarian, repressive regime. You have to be in dialogue with your society on one way or another. You can give on some aspect, not give on some other. So I think there is a will to try to activate some segment of the society to be more positive about the regime. I think they understand that something confrontational would be very difficult for them to win. And so they are trying to create kind of co-creational mechanism of kind of involving the societies without challenging any of their economic and political power. And I think on that they are quite similar to what is happening in many other countries in the region. I mean, the Russian regime is also in this kind of balance between preserving the kind of personal liberties as much as possible and limiting any kind of political engagement from the societies, and also preserving their economic power.
Next question. Do you think that border travel restrictions imposed during COVID will endure in the region? Specifically, do you think this could result in lasting change for labor migration and the remittance economy?
Yeah, that's a good point. I think it was a kind of shock for the state of the region to realize that even those who were a member of the Eurasian Economic Union, like Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan, were stopped at the border during the worst time of the lockdown in Russia, just the same way that like the European Union was unable to have a kind of coordinated policy at the beginning during the first week of the crisis in the spring. The same, the Eurasian Economic Union kind of didn't work in protecting labor migrants who were traveling inside the region. I think that Russia is very much committed to having freedom of mobility, freedom of movement from member states of the Eurasian Economic Union. Russia needs labor migrants, even if its economy is slowing down. And I think it's a very strong element of the Putin's regime to consider that it's part of its own kind of regional power over Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan. So I think that's kind of travel limitation will disappear with the crisis kind of diminishing. The border tension you had between countries that are not part of the Eurasian Economic Union and the other are maybe more difficult. And clearly for Tajikistan and Uzbekistan, it was really a very strong element of realizing that if you are not part of the Eurasian Economic Union, then your migrants are really can find themselves. I mean, there were thousands of Uzbek migrants blocked at the Kazakh border during the spring. There were Tajik migrants blocked also for a very long time. So I think there is this feeling here that freedom of movement will not be as easy as it was during the last 20, 30 years in the collapse of the Soviet Union. It will be more and more difficult. And maybe that's a factor that Russia will use to try to push Tajikistan and Uzbekistan toward the Eurasian Economic Union, because it's a great leverage tool that Moscow has in saying to these two countries that if they don't join the Eurasian Economic Union, then their migrants will not be able to circulate as freely as the Kyrgyz one. And it's less important for Kazakhstan because it has less labor migrants.
Great. So our last question comes from my colleague, Thane Gustafson. Could you expand on what you mean by the increasing strategic presence of Russia in the region? What specific forms is this taking? And then he would also like you to recommend in the chat section a couple of links or published references with up-to-date analysis that we can assign to our students. And then he also wants to know who is, of course, apart from yourself, who's doing the best writing and analysis on Central Asia at the moment.
Well, I think there are great research going on in Central Asia. The Central Asian research field has been just booming and flourishing. You have a lot of work that has done in political science, in cultural anthropology, in gender studies, Islam studies. It's really a booming field with a lot of publication, and I'm happy to send several links after. I think the Russian strategic presence is growing or is kind of reinforcing itself in Kazakhstan, clearly. You can look at the latest agreement or reshaping of the military agreement between Kazakhstan and Russia. The Kazakhs have less and less kind of strategic autonomy. Their air defense system is really now linked to Russia. Their whole military industrial complex is linked to Russia. If you look at the number of Central Asian globally soldiers and officers who get trained abroad, it's still very largely trained in Russian military academies. So Russia still has this kind of military prestige, very strong for the region, and even stronger now that Putin has also kind of been playing that card and reinforcing the prestige of the Russian army. So if you are coming from a military circle in Central Asia, looking at what Russia is doing is really a kind of almost the must that you may hope to get. So in terms of military training, military equipment, selling weapons, military industrial cooperation, I think Russia is still running the show all over the region, especially, of course, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, and even, in fact, Uzbekistan, Tajikistan. It's only Turkmenistan where it's maybe less. And then I think it's very difficult. So NATO countries have been really slowing down their cooperation in the region, and I think now it's at a very modest level with no big hope of anything changing in the years to come. And China, even if we discussed a lot about the Chinese military presence in the region, clearly China has been trying to get some inroads in Tajikistan at the military level. It's still so far away from China, from Russia, just for logistical reason, right? If you are a Central Asian officer, if you get trained in a Chinese military academy, you will be trained in Russian with all the other post-Soviet colleagues because you don't speak Chinese, right? So you will be, in fact, trained in a post-Soviet framework with your colleagues, and that will reinforce your kind of post-Soviet military identity more than creating any links with the Chinese military. So I think on that, China still has the prestige and still very strong connection at the military level. The intelligence circles, of course, all the security services, all the Ministry of Emergency Situation, all that is still very much linked to Russia, inspired by the way the Russian regime is reforming its security services. So I think on that, Russia is still on a very solid ground.
Thank you very much. We still have a few more minutes if there are any more questions, although I don't actually see any more in the Q&A function. I'm delighted that the electricity seems to have worked.
Yes.
This was really a very, very interesting discussion, and so many trends to watch and so many, as you say, contradictory tendencies in the evolution of what's happening in Central Asia. I think maybe we do have one more question. Yes. Could you please throw some light on the nuclear policy of the Central Asian countries?
Well, the 5 Central Asian countries are denuclearized, and they have even signed a treaty that makes them a very specific and unique region that is committed to denuclearization. So the only things that still link them to their nuclear policy is the Kazakhstan effort to develop its civil nuclear industry, and Kazakhstan is a big producer of uranium and also trying to develop, as I said, its civil nuclear industry, very much here also in cooperation with Russia, but with new actors entering the scene, like India, for example. Kazakhstan also tried to play a kind of constructive role in proposing that it would host a fuel bank for Iran that would be under international supervision. So the Kazakh government, I think, on that has a very elaborated, sophisticated public diplomacy of both presenting itself as a key country pushing for denuclearization because of the Semipalatinsk legacy, and also developing its civil nuclear industries and trying to solve the tension around Iran.
Thank you. Well, this has been a very rich discussion. I wish you all the best in your research that you're now doing in the Russian Federation. And we will look forward, obviously, to reading what you're researching, to listening to you at other events. So thank you very much indeed for a great discussion. And till the next time, thank you.
Very good. Thank you so much, Angela, for the invitation. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.